My favorite kinds of problems are the ones that solve themselves, right? I have a charming, sweet, bright 8-year-old, and my mother promises me that despite the fact that she still needs to go to bed every night with every single transitional object she attached herself to as a baby, I will not be dropping her off at college with all of those transitional objects. And when we think about why there aren't more women in leadership roles in politics and business, people rarely think about it as a problem that's going to solve itself. But I recently heard a statistic that amazed me, and that is that currently women earn 2 bachelor's degrees for every 1 bachelor's degree that is earned by a man. And for the reverse to be true, you would have to go back to 1970, when Gwen Trindle was told that she shouldn't be looking for a position at Northwestern and shouldn't be going back to work. So, I mean, if you think about that, the pool of eligible executives, of eligible politicians, of eligible everything that requires a college degree, that pool is going to be filled with many more women than it has ever been in the past. So to some extent, it's a problem that solves itself. But as the mother of 3 young daughters, I'm concerned that it won't solve itself as quickly as it needs to. And in January of this year, Pew came out with a research poll that looked at biases that still may exist about why women aren't getting further in leadership roles in business and why they're not getting further in leadership roles in politics. And I'm going to focus on the business results because that's an area that I'm more familiar with. And to a large degree, women and men are perceived absolutely equally capable of managing large businesses, of executing difficult multi-year strategies, and doing all the things that it requires an executive to do. High executive functioning skills. And in some instances, 25% of the people polled found that women were actually better than men at things like being ethical and honest, at providing fair pay and fair benefits to their employees, at mentoring employees. So women actually exceeded men in categories that, in my experience, having come up through lots of different businesses, I would want to work for somebody who had every single one of those qualities. Where women were found lacking, and what I wanted to talk about today, were in 2 areas. And it wasn't a huge percentage of the people that were polled, but it was enough that it kind of got my back up. And that was in women are perceived as not negotiating profitable deals as well as men. And they're not perceived as taking risks as well as men. And I had a problem with that because I'm in the commercial real estate business. I'm one of the few women developers that I know. And as a result, I pretty much negotiate for a living. I negotiate with investors, I negotiate with retail tenants, I negotiate with lenders, I negotiate with office tenants, I negotiate with community residents in the communities where I have shopping centers, I negotiate with municipal officials. And I felt like women bring a much different view to the negotiation than men do. And I wanted to talk a little bit about where I think women have the advantage and where I think men have the advantage. But risk is an easy one because I think, in my experience, the idea that women are less willing to take risk than men is a perception problem. It's not a reality problem. Because if the reality was that women were unwilling to take risks the same way men were, there would be a lot fewer babies born every year. A lot fewer babies born every year. So that seemed to me clearly a perception problem. It's simply that women assess risk differently, so they take risk differently, and therefore they are perceived as being more risk averse, and we all know that that simply is not the case. But with regard to negotiating profitable deals, I think that there is a substantive difference. And what I've noticed in my experience, and I've been doing what I'm doing for probably the better part of the last 17 years, is that when you think about persuasion and you think about persuasive speech, 1,300 years ago, Aristotle described the 3 things that are necessary for persuasive speech. You need logos, pathos, and ethos. You need logic, you need emotion, and you need credibility as a speaker. And if you put all the things together, and if you think about all the speeches that you've read, all the great speeches, FDR certainly comes to mind as somebody who was so facile at combining all of those three things into something that was so persuasive. 1,300 years later, it's still the same persuasive components. But in my experience, you are so much better at persuasion if you yourself are open to being persuaded. And you are more persuasive when you are more comfortable in the environment in which you are persuading. And in my experience, men are really good at negotiating in a zero-sum context, right? So if I win, you lose. That's a zero-sum. And women are much more comfortable and therefore much more persuasive when they're negotiating in a positive-sum context, which is, this is what I need. What do you need? Let's figure out a way where we can come up with some kind of structure here where we each get most of what we need, and then we can decide if we can move forward or not. And it kind of freaks people out when I call up a retailer and I say, so what do you really need? Like, if you're going to open a store in my shopping center, what do you really need? Because they're used to, every little point and adding it up at the end of the day and seeing if it works. And the idea that it would become a collective process is not really what they're used to. And it can be problematic. But I think where women excel, and in an experience that I know people who certainly live in Winnetka would have experience with, is when a commercial property owner has to negotiate with a municipal official or community residents. Because real estate developers have a very well-earned reputation of, it's my way or the highway. And you are never further in that hole as a real estate developer than when you have to come to a municipality where you want to do something that may or may not be welcomed by the residents. And how are you going to dig your way out of that hole? Well, I can tell you from experience that digging your way out of that hole is much easier if you come in a positive-sum approach of, this is what I need, and what do you need, and maybe we can figure out a way that you get most of what you need and I get most of what I need. Nobody ever gets everything they need, and certainly you never get everything that you want, right? But the approach is so important. And I can tell you that 10 years ago, I proposed tearing down a 50-year-old, completely functionally obsolete shopping center in Toledo, Ohio, and putting in Costco and about 90,000 square feet next door. It seemed like not a controversial proposal. The shopping center I was proposing to take down was 50 years old. It was riddled with asbestos. I was going to remediate the brownfield. We were going to do all of the things that we needed to do, and we were bringing in a great business and a great employer and a great addition to the city of Toledo. We weren't kind of out in the sticks. I mean, there are homes behind us that have in-ground swimming pools. I mean, this is a fancy part of Toledo. And it was incredibly controversial. And I found myself having to be both constructive and positive-sum, and working with the people who lived immediately behind the shopping center, and working with the community residents beyond that, because we felt very strongly that we owed the people immediately behind us a different duty of information and timing, and can we clean your pool, and we need to survey your heirloom tomatoes if we're going to take down this fence. I mean, we did everything that we could to make them feel like we weren't going to bulldoze right over them. And then certainly the people that lived beyond them needed a different level of care and a different duty. And certainly with the city council and with the plan commission, that was a whole separate, very structured process. But the mayor was against us, really against us. Like press conferences with big signs, no Costco here, against us. And Costco said to me, Liz, we've been through these fights in Illinois. We don't win. You can't fight City Hall and win. And so I was trying to keep Costco in the game. I was trying to deal with the crazy mayor and doing all the things that I needed to do. He really wasn't crazy. He was doing a lot of what he needed to do to make it a campaign issue, I suppose. But what I found at the end of the day was it was very disarming, particularly to the city council, particularly to the plan commission, and most definitely to the residents, that I was very open and honest, and I simply said, this is what we have to do, and we really want to bring this business here, and nobody loves the shopping center more than I do, but it needs to be torn down and it needs to be rebuilt. And it was a fascinating experience because really, at the end of the day, we brought everybody along with us, including the mayor who vetoed our development agreement. We had to override his veto. And 2 weeks later, he and I stood next to each other in hard hats with shovels and put a shovel in the ground, and we were off to the races. And people were shocked that A, that I invited him, and B, that I stood next to him with a shovel and didn't try to bean him. And, because at this point we were 6 months past our timing and everything was changed and we had to clean people's pools, as I said, because now we were into summer and Costco had to bring people pies. But it was, it was really a fascinating experience because on the one hand I had to be very zero-sum with the mayor. There was no, he didn't want it and I said it had to be here. But I had to be very constructive with the neighbors and with the community members and with the Plan Commission and with the other city council people because they were the people ultimately who swayed the newspaper, who was very, very good at being, very much on the fence. And it was an amazing lesson because it showed me how different disagreements like this can go if you approach it completely differently. If you really try to persuade people in a way that acknowledges that they have needs too, and that it's not your way or the highway. And when I see these fights go on in other places with people who very much take that zero-sum approach, and I'm certainly painted with a very broad brush here today, and it's, it can be men and women, that's certainly a style thing, but everybody's guilty of it at any particular time. But it was an amazing lesson about how to persuade, how to be persuasive in a very hotly contested situation where, I had a tenant who was convincing that this was never going to happen, and I had to keep them there, and it ultimately came off, and it's been a great success, and it certainly has provided all the goods and services to the members of that community that we promised that it would. And I think if you think about it, and you think about how much we can learn from each other when everybody's in the same room, and everybody's on an equal footing, and everybody's getting equal pay, that is most certainly the message. And I truly believe it's a problem that solves itself. Thank you.